All right, everybody, our next exercise in this chapter is 23-7. H.J. Heinz Company uses standards to control its material costs. Assuming that a batch of ketchup, 7,650 pounds, has the following standards. So I'm going to tell you this fact that ketchup was originally created to cover up rancid food when food was sold past its prime before there was refrigeration. And so it was Heinz that came up. There used to be hundreds of different ketchups, but Heinz came up with this one. But I know, gross, right? Life is good these days, even with COVID. All right, so they tell us for the 7,650 pounds, they tell us how many whole tomatoes, how many pounds, vinegar, what we're paying, corn syrup, and salt. And then they tell us the actual materials in a batch may vary from the standard due to tomato characteristics. Assume that the actual quantities of materials for batch 8-99 were as follows. So they tell us what the actual was. And then they say determine the standard unit materials cost per pound for a standard batch, and then round the per unit answer to the nearest whole cent. Okay, so we're going to come up here, and what we can find out first is we can look at our standard. So I'm going to do my whole tomatoes. And I'm going to put my standard quantity. So the standard quantity for a batch is 5,000 pounds of tomatoes. And the standard price is, they tell us, 75 cents per pound. So that's going to give me a standard cost per batch of whole tomatoes of $3,750. I'm going to do the same thing for the vinegar. So I'm going to take the standard quantity of 350 gallons times the 0.90% standard price. That's going to give me $315 for vinegar. Corn syrup. Corn syrup is 40 gallons times $7.50 a gallon. That's expensive. Is $300. And then salt is 125 pounds times $1.80. I wonder what it would be if they use sugar instead of corn syrup. So that comes to $225. So those are our standard costs. And so the standard cost per batch is going to come to a total. We're going to have a total there of $4,590. If I divide that by 7,650 pounds, because that is the amount of pounds, we're going to get a standard unit materials cost of 60 cents per pound. So this is our standard unit materials cost. And that's, so that's when you're filling out for A, okay? So they have you do that. There's your standard per batch, okay? So that's A. And then for B, it says determine the direct materials quantity variance for batch 8099. So what I'm going to do here is I'm going to put, how do I want to do this? First, let's calculate out our amount, our actual cost. So here we're going to do our actual quantities. Let's see how I want to do this. We're going to do our actual quantity at the standard price. So we're going to go with our tomatoes first. And the problem told us that we used 4,900 pounds. of tomatoes, and we multiply that times $75, and that's going to give us an amount of $3,675. So that's our actual cost here, as opposed to this is standard. Remember, standard's budget and actual is actual. So we start off with our tomatoes there. For our vinegar, we used 375 gallons, and we paid 90 cents per gallon again, and that amount comes to $337.50. We're going to use our corn syrup, and we used a total of 36 gallons, and we paid $7.50 per gallon. So the total amount for corn syrup was $270. And then finally we have our salt. We used 140 pounds of salt times $1.80. And that equals $252, right? So you can already tell by looking, and this is one of the first times we're actually going to be looking, but what you can see here is if you're looking at the standard quantity of tomatoes is 5,000. We only used 4,900, right? So we used less than what the standard amount or the budgeted amount would be. And what's going to happen here is we're going to have spent less, right? So if our actual cost is less than our standard cost, when we work out the variance is going to be favorable. So whenever you spend less than you thought, that's favorable. If we're looking at vinegar, we use 375 gallons instead of the $350 standard. So here we're going to see $315, and instead we spent $337.50. That's going to be an unfavorable variance. We paid more than we budgeted. So if you look here, so we can see here based upon this, that 36 gallons is less than the standard. That's going to be a favorable variance. And the salt is going to be an unfavorable variance. So the way you work this out, and as we work on them, the way you set it up, so here I'm going to put our ingredients. I'm going to put materials, quantity, variance, and the materials quantity variance comes because we've used either more or less than the standard amount of product. We'll also have a materials price variance, which will depend on whether we paid more or less than the standard per unit on the quantity. So we'll do those in the next problem. And then they're going to be favorable or unfavorable. So the way you calculate it out, so if we're looking at our tomatoes, if we have our standard here, the standard amount was $3,750. We're going to subtract that from the actual amount of $3,675. I've got them backwards. Hold on. Pause 1 second. Sorry, forgive my dyslexia on that. I want your math to work right. You start with your actual cost, which was $3,675. You're going to subtract your standard cost, which was $3,750, right? So that's going to give you negative $75. Remember, if it's negative, that means that it's a favorable variance. So that one's favorable. Then we go to vinegar. The actual cost was $337.50, and the standard cost was $315. When I subtract the standard from the actual, that's going to give me an amount of $22.50 positive. When it's positive, it's unfavorable. It means we paid $22.50 more than the standard would have been. If we're looking at our syrup, our actual cost was $270 and the standard is $300. Again, we're going to have a negative number when we do that of $30. So we're going to have $30 favorable here. And then on our salt, we had actual of 252, a standard of 225. It's going to leave us with $27 left over. That's unfavorable. So then when you're finished looking at everything, you're going to combine everything up to get the total variance. So we've got what, $105 in unfavorable variances, and we have $49.50 we have $105 in favorable variances, $49.50 in unfavorable. We net those out. We're going to end up with a total direct materials quantity variance, $50.50 favorable. Remember, you always want to be on the right side if you have to go talk to your boss about budget variances. You always want to try and have a favorable variance. All right, and that's how you solve exercise 23-7.